Any of you hate getting shot, like from the doctor? Like, I don't mean like just sort of hate it. Like, anybody have like close to a phobia? Like, really hate it? No, raise your hand. Anybody? No, nobody. I see head shaking. Nobody raised their hand. I'm assuming Joe, you do. Derek, huh? Sonia, yeah. I don't have a phobia. I've gotten better at it over the years, but as a child, I'm thinking a lot of you can probably relate to this. I hated shots. I can remember very clearly, because they say, you know, with traumatic experiences, you either see it very clearly or you block it out altogether, right? And I remember very clearly getting shots in my rear end, and very, very painful. But even more so, I remember getting shots in the mouth at the dentist, and I hated that. And they would always tell you, Derek, they would always say that it's going to be a little pinch, yes, and like a little bug bite. And so I'm thinking of this mosquito, you know, which that's nothing. It itches a little bit, but Jeremy, it was like a wasp, and stinging you in your mouth. It was horrible. But one of the things, a couple of things that helped me get through those shots was, one, a little bit knowing their purpose. Not like this is going to be good for you, kid, because that never worked. I mean, my son, the oldest one, he hates shots as well. I mean, just saying it's good for you, that's not, okay, well, vitamins are good for you too. You know, vegetables are good for you as well. But knowing that, like, hey, something worse can happen to you if you don't take these shots always helps. But then also knowing my dad, knowing that he was always there by my side. And that helped me tremendously. I didn't get to avoid the shots. You know, I might beg, you know, Dad, is there any other way? You know, do I have to have this for school? And the answer would be like, yes, there's no other way, son. But knowing that my dad was always there kind of gave order to my little world and helped me get through that. Well, the 7 churches in Revelation that John is writing to, Jesus has a message for them, and it's important because they're about to go through a lot more than a shot. They're about to be tested. They're about to suffer persecution and trials and tribulation, and so it's important that if they're going to make it through these trials, they need to know the gravity of their calling in the world as a church and who it is that stands by their side. Jesus needs to prepare John for an authoritative message, a very sobering message that he has for these 7 churches. But in this passage, we find that Jesus also prepares us for these messages. You see, there were other churches in the area. You know, remember I said that these churches were all in modern day Turkey. Actually, you can bring up that slide if y'all can. I see y'all probably working on something back there, but remember these are 7 literal churches within what is Asia Minor back then. It's known as, it's the nation of Turkey right now, and off there on the island, that's where John is located, on the island of Patmos, about 35 miles from the shoreline. But there were other churches in the area, and obviously in the Roman Empire there were tons more churches that have been set up by the apostles. So why is he only limiting his messages for these 7 churches? Because that number 7, it's a number of completion. You know, the world was made in 7 days, 6 days, and then the day of rest, and then you have things like when Peter asked Jesus, you know, how often should I forgive my brother? You know, 7 times. He said, no, 70 times 7. You know, it wasn't a math equation per se. He was telling him that you should always forgive your brother, your sister. And so, though he is writing specifically to these 7 churches, we can't forget that. There's an initial context. There's a message for the other churches as a whole in the area and throughout the Roman Empire all the way to Jerusalem. But we can also glean from this today as well. So Jesus prepares us for these messages that we're going to go over in the next several weeks, and also prepares us for any trial and tribulation that we might face today.
So, hard times, not only hard times, but hard messages, which some of these churches are about to receive some hard words from Jesus. They require encouragement, and they also require, I believe, empathy. And we see this in John's words. He opens up by saying that he's a partner with them. He's come alongside them. He shares with them. He's a partner in their tribulation, and also in the kingdom. I love that. The tribulation, but also the kingdom. You know, our Lord Jesus, He brought about the kingdom into the world, right? But he had to endure suffering in order for that to take place. So many of us, we also have to endure suffering. These people, these early churches, were having to endure much suffering. So he says, I'm a partner with you in the tribulation, in the kingdom, in the patient endurance in Jesus Christ. And he says he's on the island of Patmos on account of the word of God, the testimony of Jesus. You know, he's been exiled, you know, so I share, you know, firsthand, I am on the island of Patmos. I've been exiled because of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I share in your pain and your suffering. And so I think sometimes, you know, a lot of times when people are suffering or we have a hard word for somebody, a lot of times we like to show up and we immediately like to start fixing the problem. But that's not what John does. He says, me too. He says, you know, I hear you. I feel your pain. That's empathy. The ability to come alongside someone and feel their pain. To say, I understand what you're going through. Even sometimes when we don't agree with somebody, to at least understand where they're going through. That has power. A lot of times when we just step in and we start trying to fix problems or fix situations, people turn a deaf ear. But when we empathize with them, they're softened. They're prepared. I think it's important that we as believers, when we're encouraging one another and we're empathizing with one another, that we share our weaknesses and our victory equally. They're both equally important. You know, a lot of times as Christians, we think we've got to put on a certain persona because we're supposed to have joy and peace in the Lord, right? So when we speak to everybody, everything's all rosy. But what we don't realize is that person is hearing us saying, why am I not like that? You know, I love Jesus too. I want Jesus too. Why am I struggling through this? Why am I depressed right now? Why am I having trouble believing in this area? And so I think there's a great danger in being rosy all the time. I think part of being real is revealing our weaknesses as well. And then you have, on the flip side of that, you have people in the name of being real, you know, they're just always negative and always dumping junk on everyone else. And there's no joy of the Lord, and you don't see the peace of Christ in them. So I think it's important and very powerful and transformational when we are able to when we talk to people organically in conversations, to talk about where we were and where God has brought us, the victory we've brought, you know. But then also where we're struggling now, not just in the past. Sometimes we always talk about our testimony as the past, as the past, as the past. Where we're struggling now and where we're planning to go in the future, where we still need to be, where God's still got a work to do in us. That makes sense? And so I love it that John starts this all saying, hey, I'm here with you. Me too. I hear you. I feel you. I'm your partner in this. We're suffering together. This isn't somebody just coming along with some motivational speech. Of course, the words that Jesus has, not all of it's very motivational, but they need to hear this. And then there's a call to attention. John says that he's in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. In the Spirit, I mean, we know he's probably in prayer. It could be the vision itself or just his state of being in prayer. On the Lord's Day, that's Sunday. So that shows you right there, and then other places in Acts, that early on the disciples moved worship services from the Jewish Sabbath to Sunday. So the day of the resurrection, that's why it's called the Lord's Day. So there he is on Sunday in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet. Sorry, I got to take a drink. My voice is, my throat's drying out quick. Speaking of trumpets, I used to try and imagine what Jesus' trumpet voice sounded like. I had a hard time with that. I mean, I can make trumpet noises with my mouth. Probably not now, but I would try and imagine that. But that's not the idea. The idea is the trumpet in biblical times, in Jewish culture, it was to sound an alarm. It was a call to attention, either for war or judgment, or something is about to be said. And so this voice like the trumpet doesn't mean that Jesus' voice actually sounded like a trumpet. It's a call to attention. Isaiah 58:1, God says to the prophet Isaiah, he says, "Cry aloud, do not hold back. Lift up your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their transgressions, to the house of Jacob their sins." And so, remember our discussion on Wednesday night where, like, did Jesus ever raise his voice and stuff like that? And we came to the conclusion that Jesus got angry, right? But in his anger, he never sinned, and he never lost control of himself. He was always in complete control of the situation, but he got angry. And I was under the opinion that I think Jesus did raise his voice. I think even at times when he needed to raise his voice, that wasn't a sin in order to do so. When he's raising his voice here, I don't think he's yelling at, he's not chastising John. He's not yelling at John, but he is raising his voice because something needs to be said and you need to take it seriously. You see what I mean? And so that's the trumpet sound. It's a call to attention. And he says, write down what you see and send it to the 7 churches. And then he goes on and he names those 7 literal churches that we saw on our map earlier. And then we begin to see this vision unfold, and we see Christ's authority as head over these churches. He says when he heard this voice like a trumpet, he turns in verse 12 to see the voice. And what he saw 7 golden lampstands. Now, we're actually going to talk about that a little bit more here in a little bit. But this is the image. Would you go to the first image? Yeah. So he sees, and we're going to get into the descriptions here, the figure of a son of man standing before these 7 golden lampstands. And actually, I'm going to say that there's 2 images here I want to show you. I want to say this one's cooler, but the other one a little bit more realistic. I don't think, to me, my opinion, any illustration I've ever seen in the history of my life that has to do with eschatology has never been cool. It's people trying to create a picture of heavenly things that we can't fathom. And it just always falls short, almost to the point of corny in my mind. Yeah. But go to the next one, so I like the other image better. But because this is bad Photoshop. This is like when I was first started at Stephen F. Austin in graphic design type of Photoshop work. But it's likely that it was a menorah that he saw, because this menorah is what was in the Jewish temple, in the tabernacle before that. It stood before the most holy place, and it represented the God's people, the people of Israel, and it represented the blessing and life for the people of Israel that only came from God. He was their source, and so those candles needed to be lit at all times in the temple and tabernacle, because God was their source of light in the world. So then we see, in the midst of these lampstands, is one like a son of man. And so when the original readers read this, that's going to draw their attention to something. One like a son of man stands in the midst of the lampstands. What does son of man mean? Well, I mean, a lot of us, you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, equally spread throughout all those Gospels. Jesus is often referring to himself as the Son of Man. So what does that mean? I think one of the first things that comes to mind is he's called the Son of God. So what does that mean? That he's divine, right? He's divine in nature, but he's also the Son of Man. Like, he had God as his father, but Mary, man means human being. It doesn't mean gender always. But Mary is his mother, so he's fully human. He's fully human and fully God, so he's Son of God, but he's also son of Man. Like, we can relate to him. Not only does God relate to him, but we also relate to him. But there's a little something more. I would say a lot something more. Well, we find in Ezekiel, strange enough, all through that book of the Bible, Ezekiel is constantly referred to as the Son of Man. None of the other apostles, you don't see that in their book. Son of Man, Son of Man, Son of Man. But Ezekiel's always referred to as the Son of Man. And there's a similarity at the beginning of Ezekiel's mission that mirrors Jesus. He was called to the people of Israel. So in one sense, Jesus, one like Ezekiel, who was a man, who was a prophet to the people of Israel, so is Jesus. And so obviously we know he's much more than a man. He's much more than a prophet. He's much more than Ezekiel. But there's that mirror image there. But then in Daniel chapter 7, there's a vision. We read it this morning during worship of Daniel sees one like a Son of Man who appears before the Ancient of Days, and all authority on heaven and earth is given to him. He's given a kingdom and dominion. And so when he says one like a Son of Man, they see the similarity of the visions in their mind. Immediately goes to Daniel chapter 7 and that vision that he saw. And so what's this description of the Son of Man that John sees that is similar to Daniel, even similar to some of the things that Ezekiel saw during his lifetime? But let's take a look at this. One, he was wearing, the Son of Man was wearing a long robe with a golden sash around his chest. That's a priestly order, but also his rank, a very high ranking in this gold sash around his chest. Very similar to another vision that Daniel sees in Daniel chapter 10, which scholars in this particular vision, a very similar description of this man, but there's some disagreement on whether it's an angel that's being described or whether it's actually a pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. There's some debate about chapter 10 of Daniel, not chapter 7. It's very evident who that is, but this Daniel, it's either Jesus or it's another heavenly figure. I mean, all heaven's creations are, God's creations in heaven are very glorious. People fall before angels. They're not to worship them, but if you saw an angel today, trust me, you would be taken back in awe at its appearance. So, Daniel chapter 10, there's a man that appears that Daniel sees. Whether it's Jesus or an angel, there's debate. But he too has a robe, though it's shorter, and he has a golden sash. But in Daniel 10, it's around his, it's like more like a belt than it is around his chest. John next sees this Son of Man. He has hair that's white like wool. It's white like snow. This is a description of God, the Ancient of Days, interestingly enough, in Daniel chapter 7. Not the Son of Man, but the Ancient of Days. He has eyes like a flame of fire. That's like God. There's fire seen in Daniel chapter 7. Also the man in Daniel chapter 10. There's fire in his description. He has feet like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace. It's just gleaming. That's similar to the man in Daniel chapter 10. And he has a voice like the roar of many waters. Like, picture like Niagara Falls. Anybody ever been to Niagara Falls? I haven't. Some of you have. So you could probably relate better than I can. I have to YouTube and then turn it up and listen. But that's the most powerful illustration I could think of what's being described here. In Daniel chapter 10, the man was described as a voice of a multitude. So think about being at an Astros game during the playoffs. In the crowd, they're chanting something. Or a soccer game, you know how they chant? They may be chanting certain phrases or whatever. And so picture that. I could see how a voice of a multitude and a voice of waters, maybe it's the description of two, the same type of sound, but two different people describing what they're hearing. I don't know. But when you're talking about a voice like the roar of many waters, listen to a few of these references. Psalm 93:4 says, mightier than the thunders of many waters, mightier than the waves of the sea, the Lord on high is mighty. One of the things I forgot to bring up at the beginning of the message is we do have bulletins over there, and they're totally blank inside. And so if anybody, this type of sermon series, there may be a lot of notes you want to take. And so if you do, you're one of those, and you need something to write, those bulletins are available. Ezekiel 1:24 says so he has a vision of these heavenly creatures, and it said that when these heavenly creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings. It was like the roar of rushing waters. And then he says, like the voice of the Almighty. So here we have the Son of Man. He's speaking, and it sounds like the roar of many waters. And then here you see in Ezekiel, he's saying that these wings flapping reminded him of the voice of the Almighty, which is like the rush of many waters, like the tumult of an army. Ezekiel 43:2, last reference here, God's voice was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. So here you have guys trying to describe what they are hearing and what they are seeing in terms that we can understand. In his right hand, he held 7 stars. Interesting. More on that later. And from his mouth came a sharp, 2-edged sword. Now, here's the thing. There's no need to picture Jesus, with the sword hanging out of his mouth. That's not what Jesus looks like. He's trying to, there's a point he's trying to get across here. Hebrews 4:12, for the word of God is living and active, it's sharper than any 2-edged sword, piercing the division of soul and spirit, of joints and of marrow, and discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart. So the same one who spoke the world and it leapt into existence is the one, when he speaks, he has creative power, and he also has the power to judge. And even in this word, what he's left us behind, many of you can relate. If you not only read this word, we talked about this on Wednesday, but you allow this word to read you. You allow God to read you as you're digging in this word. You've witnessed the transformational power of this word. You experienced how it's like a 2-edged sword, how it can pierce you. Jesus is the author of this word. He's the very word of God. So there was from his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword. His words have authority. They have the power to create and to take away life. And his face was like the sun shining at full strength. Daniel, in his vision in chapter 10, with the man he saw, his face was like lightning. Again, could be the same description, just using different words. So, as we saw, Ezekiel, said earlier, Ezekiel had similar vision. He saw a magnificent human figure in some of his visions as well. Chapters 1 and 3 at the beginning of Ezekiel, chapters 8 through 11, chapters 40 through 48, we see some of Ezekiel's very much apocalyptic type visions, very highly symbolic visions. And it's interestingly enough, in Ezekiel's first vision, chapters 1 through 3, it warned of the first destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple. And so possibly that could be a hint that the first fulfillment, at least, of this book and what John's about to write had to do with the second destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Very similar language being used. But then I want to go back. I want to revisit Daniel chapter 7. Because in Daniel chapter 7, in his vision, there are 2 very interesting figures that are presented here. The Ancient of Days and the Son of Man. Beginning of verse 9, Daniel looks and he says, as I looked, thrones were placed and the Ancient of Days took his seat. says that his clothing was white as snow. Who did that describe in John's vision? Jesus. All right? This is the Ancient of Days. This is our Father in heaven on his throne. His clothing is white as snow. The hair on his head was like pure wool. That's John's description of Jesus. From his throne there was fiery flames. Its wheels were like burning fire. Streams of fire issued and came out before him. We saw that Jesus' his eyes were as fire. And 1,000 served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. He is the king. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. Now, we skip down to verse 13, and we see his next vision, his next appearance. With the clouds of heaven came one like a son of man. Now, there was a reason last week I said the first image you should get when you think about Jesus coming on the clouds of heaven is not just, if all you get out of that is Jesus surfing on some clouds, then you're missing the point. Because when Jesus would say that, behold, you're going to see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, they're not like, oh, wow, you're going to be flying in the sky. I mean, again, I'm not saying that is or isn't going to happen, when Jesus returns. What I'm saying is their minds would immediately gone back to Daniel chapter 7. That's the reason that some of them were gnashing their teeth and so offended, because what he was saying that he was. With the clouds of heaven came one like a son of man, and he came before the Ancient of Days. And he was presented before him, and he was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, languages should serve him. His dominion, an everlasting dominion, shall not pass away, and his kingdom shall not be destroyed. So we see in John's vision, it's almost like a mesh description of the Ancient of Days and of Jesus, of the Son of Man. And I remember when I used to try and picture God's throne room, because sometimes it's good to get that mental picture. I mean, just this morning, we're in Revelation, right? And I'm thinking about God's throne room. It's good to create a heart and a mindset of reverence, right? So I'm thinking to myself before the throne. I remember I used to think, well, how do I picture this? Because I need the Father, and I got to put Jesus at the right hand of the Father, and how do I do this? I want to make sure I get it right. I don't want to get my theology, wrong or whatever. And what John is revealing here is that it's okay to just see Jesus. You're not offending the Father if you just see Jesus on the throne. Because although in the Trinity we know that they're one God yet three persons, Jesus says, when you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So when you look at Jesus, you're seeing through to the Father. And so you see the two pictured as one Son of Man. He was given all the authority that belonged to the Father. He is given to Jesus, and he's the one that sits on the throne. All the dominion. All that stuff that belonged to the Father in Daniel is given to Jesus. He's presented before the Father, and it's given. The Ancient of Days hands it over to Jesus. All authority is given to him. And so when you see the Son of Man sitting on the throne, you're not offending the Father. You're giving him much, much pleasure and much joy. And then so we see Daniel's vision, John's vision, and we see Christ's authority as head over the churches. And then we see Christ's victory as head over the church. Not only his authority, but also his victory as head over the churches. He says in verse 17, back to our Revelation passage, John says that when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. And he laid his right hand on me. And he said, fear not. Oh, so good. So good. And this is like a couple weeks ago. I'm sorry I keep going back to those Wednesday night. I promise I'm not promoting lying. But hashtag lying. No, but seriously, it keeps reminding me of some of the discussions we had about the fear of the Lord. And Proverbs is very much about the fear of the Lord. And sometimes we have discussion, we have trouble defining, not defining. We know that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom and it's reverence and awe, but it almost seems like it's more than that. But yet you don't want people to fear God as you would like, Freddy Krueger, or you know what I'm saying, or Hitler or whatever. And so it's hard to describe, because when people in the Bible see the holy God, they fall as dead. I mean, it's much more than, hey, Mr. President. You know, there's a reverence when you meet the president. There should be, even if you don't like him. You know, there's the office, the position. You know what I mean? But these people fell as though dead when they saw this heavenly figure. And that's what that description that John is presenting to the churches is supposed to create. Is a gravity of who this is. But yet, he falls as dead. And what does Jesus do? He lays his hand on him and says, fear not. I am the first and the last. And the beginning and the end. I mean, I've got the whole timeline. This world's timeline is already planned out as far as I see things. I'm the living one. What does he mean there? I died. Behold, I am alive forevermore. I'm the human being, and I'm stressing that. I'm the human being that defeated death. And because I am God, I have authority. I have the keys, he says, or the next part. I have the keys of death and Hades. Because of my victory over the grave, I hold the keys. I have the power to free you from death and Hades. So he's comforting John. Because John belongs to him. Remember we talked about last week? Despite some of these hard words, that if you're a child of God, you're a part of his church, his people, you belong to him. And so these things should be a comfort to us. Doesn't change the situation. Just I'm still getting the shot in my rear end or in my mouth, you know, the illustration that we started with. I still got to go through that. But who do I belong to, and what's my purpose, or what's the purpose? So he says in verse 19, write the things that you have seen. What's the things that he's seen? Well, the Son of Man standing before these lampstands with these 7 stars in his hand. He says, write the things, those that are, like what is going on right now. So when he writes the letters, when we get into the letters of the 7 churches, those are the things that are, the things that they're going through, and those that are to take place after this. That's when the debate starts. We can get in more into that. That's where I presented all those views last week. Some people say like literally after that. Some people say no, 2,000 years after that. Some people say from then to now, you know. And so there's those different things. We'll get into that later. Verse 20, he says, the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand, those are the angels of the 7 churches. What does that mean? Because literally the word angel, did you know it means messenger? It means messenger. So there's heavenly messengers, and there are some times where something can be translated angel, but it means messenger. So here's 3 possibilities. 1, each church has a guardian angel. That would be cool. Wouldn't that be cool? Like, we have a guardian angel over the Haven Community Church. I think that'd be pretty cool. So I like that idea. So he has that in his hands. 1 is like the 7 like literal human messengers that John's going to pass these on to take it to the 7 churches. All right, and there's a certain route that he would take. Well, the map isn't up there anymore, but there's a certain route. Yeah, so he would start in Ephesus. They're written in order, and it'd be like a horseshoe. You see that? So there was a certain path, and that's the order that the letters are written. Like he would start there at Ephesus and go up around there and end at Laodicea. So it could have been that messenger saying God's in control of the message and where it's going. And then they say it could also be pastors or bishops as the messengers of the church, the mouthpiece of those churches. Me personally, that'd be pretty cool too. Anyways, he's got the church in his hands. You know what I mean? He's got the church in his hands, and then he says the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches themselves. The 7 churches. You see in the tabernacle it was Israel, but now the mystery has been revealed that it's not Jews only, it's not Israel only. It's Gentile also, Jew and Gentile. That's God's people. That's the makeup of God's people. So we see here the 7 lamps that are lit before Jesus represent the church. So you have those 7 literal churches, but remember that 7 is the number of completion. So it's the church as a whole that is lifted up into heavenly places, as Ephesians says. They're seated with Christ. Oh, it's good stuff. Such good stuff. Great persecution is breaking out in these churches. They're already going through it, and they're about to go through a lot more. Whether you place this before 70 AD because Nero is reigning, he was a wicked, wicked emperor, or the time of Domitian in 90 AD, who was another wicked, wicked emperor. They're about to go through a living hell of persecution. And so this is about to break out in the churches, but Jesus wants them to know that he has it all in his hands. And he has the power to keep their lamps lit. So I don't know what 2019 has for us as a church. And we can make plans and set goals, but only God knows the future of what's to come our way. And in the next few weeks, we're going to actually hold up the mirror as to where we're at now as a church. As we look at these, God's messages for these 7 churches. And he wants them to reflect. He wants them to look in the mirror. And God, I believe he wants us here in 2019 to look in the mirror as a church and hear the messages to these 7 churches. And that's painful. That's painful. I think a lot of times, as believers, especially those of us who are really growing in our faith, we grow in God's word, right? And we go out and we do things for the Lord, right? But when it comes to letting God in here, letting his light shine in here and show the dark areas that still need to be conformed to his image, we don't like that. That's, I thought I was good. I thought I was righteous. I thought I was a good Christian. No, God wants to show you something. There's still areas. That's why you always say, we've got to learn to welcome God's heart surgery. And that's not for new believers. That's for us who've been around a while. We've got to continue to allow God to do things in our lives, or we're going to get cold, and we're going to see that. It's a message for all of us. There's going to be all sorts in these 7 churches that need to heed this message. We need to listen. We need to be sober. We need to allow God to hold up the mirror in our lives. But no matter, there's encouragement, no matter what we see, or what 2019, I hope it's as much blessing as 2018 was, because for me, I know some of you, we've all got different individual lives, but as far as this church goes, and then me personally, 2018 was, 2017 kind of, the Astros won the World Series, but you know what I mean. No matter what we may see, or where we may go as a church, we cannot take for granted that our lamp, and when I say our lamp, what do I mean? It's on your shirts there. Not the logo, but the Haven, this group. This group. Our lamp is lit in heaven. God is very aware of this church and what it's doing and what it's all about. He sees our light. He's the author of our light. He's the reason that we even exist here in Old Town Spring. We can't take for granted that our lamp is lit before Jesus Christ in heaven. Do you see that the church is so much more? And when I say things like this, it's like, you're just trying to get people in church. No. Do you see that the church is so much more than a common gathering? What is the church to you? What is the Haven to you? And I'm not promoting the Haven. I'm talking about this gathering. It could be anything. Us, the local church. What is this to you? Is it just a meeting place? Is that what it is? Ask yourself that. Allow God to hold up the mirror. What is this to you? Or is it something more? Is it something much, much more? Do you see our lampstand lit in heaven? Do you see our purpose? Do you see the one who stands in our midst? Because if we let that sink in, these 7 churches that John writes to, they need to let this sink in. That vision of heaven, of their lampstands, and one like a son of man standing in its midst with the 7 stars in his right hand, they need to let that image sink in. It needs to create gravity to the situation so that they can be prepared for what's about to happen. Because if they're not, if they don't get it, if they don't sink in, if it's just a common gathering, then when the fire comes, they're going to flee. And I'm telling you, if this is a common gathering, and persecution, trials, tribulations, whether it's in your individual lives or whether we really truly seek or have real persecution in the United States of America, you're going to flee. If this isn't sinking in, if this isn't sinking in the purpose of all this. So it's not about trying to get more butts in the seat on Sunday morning. It's about who we are in Christ. It's so much more. You heard me say our vision this morning. It's not just about this gathering. It's about what we're doing out there. We have an identity. We have a purpose. And there's so much transformational power in belonging and identity and purpose. I mean, the world is seeking after those things. And I say the world, I include us in that. I don't mean the world versus the church. We're seeking after that. Why? Because we were created for identity, belonging, and purpose. Did you know that? I mean, that's part of who we are. I mean, that's the reasons, some of us are scarred from childhood. Maybe you weren't picked first on the team. You were, always had that fear that you were picked last, or you walked into a lunchroom and you're trying to find a place to sit, and you knew you couldn't sit certain places because you're wanting to belong. And you still want a sense of identity. You want a place to be accepted. You want a place to belong. And that's the reason that the teenagers begin to create that sense of identity. The punks or the skaters, or you couldn't fit in, you go be with the geeks or the cowboys, People are looking, we were created that way, to have a sense of belonging and identity. And a sense of purpose. We all want a sense of purpose. Everybody's walking around asking, what's my purpose? Well, we belong to the Ancient of Days. We belong to the Son of Man. We're in his hands. That's our identity. In church, by welcoming others in, by loving on others, showing them the light of Christ, and even those new believers to Christ, by accepting them and giving them a place of belonging, a family, though you may have a blood family, giving them a spiritual family. That's why I always say in the church, if somebody starts connecting with others, then you've got them. Because when they start connecting and they start finding friends and places of belonging, they start finding their sense of identity. So we need to create that in us because we belong to Christ. And as the church, the goal is to bring people into communion with Christ, into the fellowship of believers, right? We belong to somebody. We belong to the man who stood in the midst of those lampstands, and we have a purpose. It's to glorify God and to spread his fame through the message of Jesus Christ to the world. And no matter what we face, we can be prepared. What's the call? The call is to be faithful and to persevere. No matter what comes, to be faithful and to persevere. That's going to be the message to the 7 churches. But for now, I just want us to be encouraged, but be sobered. Be sobered. One like a Son of Man stands in our midst. Let that sink in.